Hello, and welcome to The Diverse Bookshelf with me, Samia Aziz. On this show, I interview incredible authors doing a deep dive into important themes and issues while talking all things books. On this week's episode, I'm talking to the incredible Dana Dajani, a Palestinian spoken word artist, singer, actress, and activist. We're talking about the incredible power of storytelling and poetry in preserving history, connecting us to our ancestors, resistance, and activism. We talk a lot about what's happening in Palestine today, where as of today, over 30,000 people have been killed in the ongoing brutal war and genocide taking place in Gaza. I asked Dana about her Palestinian heritage, the life of her beloved grandmother, activism, and so much more. Dana Dajani is an award-winning Palestinian writer, performer, and advocate. She lives and works between the Middle East, Europe, and the US. Dana's work as an actress, trainer, and consultant has taken her around the world, from performing at the Sydney Opera House to creating a drama therapy program for children with autism, where she was honoured as Emirates Woman Artist of the Year and received the Young Arab Award for Entertainment, among other recognitions. Known for her original spoken word poetry, Dana's background in theatre has informed and influenced her writing and allowed her to create a unique style of solo performance art. Part spoken word, part one-woman show, Dana uses gesture, character, and a simple scarf to transport audiences across various social justice themes through her characters. I'm so glad she's my guest today. Dana, Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the Diverse Bookshelf podcast. Thank you so much for joining me. It is so lovely to have you on the show today.
Thank you for inviting me, Samia. It's a pleasure to be with you.
I am a huge fan of the work that you do. You are an insanely talented poet, artist. Also, you sing, like you have a really very harmonious voice, mashallah. But I want to hear a little bit about what's your creative journey been like? How did you get to this point where this is what you do a lot of the time? You are a poet. Yeah, what's it been like for you?
I have to tell you that my journey all began with reading. As a child, I loved to read. I loved to read out loud. That lent itself naturally to being like the narrator in the school play. I fell in love with theater. My parents said, "Don't think that's something you could do with your life." And I said, so we had this debate. And when I went to school, I was going to study English and business. That's what my parents wanted me to study. And I was really interested in theater. So eventually I transitioned to studying theater, much against my parents' wishes. And we did separate from each other for some time. I said, if I had two lives to live, I would live one for you and one for myself. But I really know that this is where my calling lies. So I have to give that to myself. And in the end, they acquiesced, they accepted, they supported me in that. And it was years later that I brought my passion of poetry into my passion of theater, because after graduation, I studied in the States and I moved to Dubai. In Dubai, there wasn't really a theater community that was very mature or established, but there was quite a nuanced poetry scene. There were many different poetry collectives and different gatherings. There was Poeticians, and then there was Book Munch, and then there was Dubai Poetry Slam, and Rooftop Rhythms. So there were many different collectives, many different spaces to share poetry. And so I brought theater into the space of poetry just to give each piece its own persona, its own character, its own language, really differentiate the themes that I'm working with by pulling them into different characters and contexts. And so, yeah, that's how it all started, from reading to reading out loud and performing, to realizing that I wanted to perform my own pieces, that the scripts that were coming at me as a young actress were quite misogynistic, were quite Islamophobic, were really not telling the stories that I wanted to tell or that I even wanted to be associated with telling. So to say, all right, I'm going to slip into this lane of poetry where I get to create these vignettes, these like monologues, where I can showcase in different scenes so many different things and bring to the table the stories that really interest me.
That's really interesting because, of course, as well as a poet and a singer, you're an actor. And I think it's so great. I loved what you said when you just said, if I had two lives, I would live one for me and I would live one for you, you being your family. And I think that will strike a chord with so many people. I think especially like daughter of immigrants or like children whose parents are not from the West typically.
Yeah.
And it's so difficult sometimes to find that balance, marrying like what our parents want for us and what they think is good and is right and is successful and is stable with the passions that we have inside of us and the faith that we have in what it is that we want to do. Because a lot of it is about taking a leap of faith. Like you went to Dubai and there wasn't a theatre scene there at all, and it could have completely just fell apart, and you would have had an awkward conversation with your parents, would have been along the lines of, we told you.
What's interesting is that we're talking about 15 years ago when the role of content creator didn't exist in society. We're pre-social media wave. Yeah, there was just a few people on YouTube making a little bit of content, but it wasn't as in our homes as it is today, where everyone is a content creator in some way, shape, or form. And that's not only accepted, but it's expected in some ways. And it's really appreciated to see, is it that you have to offer the world? What's your message? What do you have to say? Get online and say it, be heard. At that point in time, it was like, oh, there's no honor and respect for our daughter to be an actress. Like, an actress, what are you going to act in Hollywood movies? And it's true that the concern is legit, because I looked at Hollywood movies and said, no, that's not the story that I want to tell. And I made a manifesto for myself as an artist of what are my values, what are my conditions, so I could know when a script came to me, is this in line with my values? If so, great. If not, interested. So that there can be no blurry lines, you know what I mean? No room for me to then turn into something that I'm not.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting because theatre, I'm in the UK, like for so long, theatre has been this very upper class, white centric entertainment activity put on by white people for white people. And I'd say like over the last maybe 5 to 10 years, there is a shift and it's changing. Like theatre companies are doing more to try and be more accessible. Going to the theatre in the UK is still quite an expensive activity. You're looking at a minimum of £25 a ticket, which is that's a lot of money to be spending. That's just one person, and that's like a very cheap seat.
That's not even West End productions.
Exactly, upwards of like £70, £100, £200. Like it's very expensive, and I don't know if that will ever really change. But I found it interesting to see like the change in casting, just the difference in people going, but also maybe not mainstream, like what you'd call it, theatre, but there are a lot of creative companies now that are putting on some plays written by people like me and you, for people like me, like very inclusive and different and wholesome, and just telling stories that are more relatable and are more interesting and are better representation than what we see in Hollywood, or more nuanced representation, I think, because we are not the Muslim community or like people of color, like the Black community, South Asians or Arabs, like no one group is a monolith.
Yeah.
So we would never look to one piece of art as this is ideal representation. Like we understand that there is a singular story being told. But I think what we look for is the nuance within which it is being told and the underlying messages that are being promoted with that. Because obviously, like some people have a whole host of experiences with regards to their cultural identity and their faith, positive and negative, and usually a mix of the two. And I think it's fine to celebrate that and to talk about that, because I also don't think we should put a veil over the things from our own communities that are bad. And I think the same way about the white community in the UK. We shouldn't hide away from the fact that they are not perfect. We should be holding them to account. A little bit more about the theatre scene in the Middle East. So I recently read a few months ago, and I've had her on the show as well, British Palestinian author Isabella Hamad, whose latest book, Enter Ghost, is about a group of actors in the West Bank who put on a play, and they put on Hamlet, and it's based all around that. I don't know if you read it, but I really enjoyed it because it wasn't what I expected, and I thought it was very interesting to have a sort of take on how these people were relating to Shakespeare. And you don't immediately make the connection, which is why theatre is still, it seems so out of reach for so many people. I loved it. I loved the commentary on theatre, and Isabella was talking about how there's a real threat that the Israeli forces or whatever, they really see theatre production as a threat. They want to shut it down, they want to control it, because there is a real power within that. I just wondered if you could reflect on some of the things that you've experienced and you've seen with regards to theatre, maybe in Palestine, but also like just more generally in the Middle East.
I haven't read Isabella's book, but I did get to hear her speak about it at the Palestine Rights Festival in Philadelphia last September. So I'm familiar with the concept of the book. And yeah, we talk about the Freedom Theater in Jenin in Palestine. Juliana Merchamis was targeted and assassinated, and we've seen a lot of the Hakawati theater group in Jerusalem also. They did a monodrama festival, I believe, maybe 5 or 6 years ago. This was also targeted by the Israeli forces and shut down. Theater is, it is of the people, by the people, for the people. And in a certain time, perhaps in the UK, yeah, it's of the white population, for the white population, by the white population. And as the country has continued to become more and more diversified, it is an inevitable outcome that the voices represented on the stage of this art form for the people and by the people would also become just as nuanced and just as diverse. I lived in Chicago, where I found that I was performing some theater about the Middle East, but none of the pieces were written by Arabs. And this is one of the reasons that I decided to move back to the region after I graduated, is because I felt we in the region tend to export all of our talent. We export our human capital, and we say it's because it doesn't exist at home. But of course, it never will, as long as all of our talent lives abroad. So to come home and to invest my time into nurturing Arab voices and also being part of the budding, at the time it was 2011 in Dubai, if there wasn't a budding theater community, there was a bit more in terms of film. But again, what we saw in film is that technically the image would get more and more sophisticated, but the stories remained really simple. Yeah, it's different because in countries like Lebanon, in countries like Egypt, Jordan lags a little bit behind that, but Syria also used to have a really thriving theater community, whether that was Khayal shadow puppetry, or it was the Hakawati, who's the lone storyteller, who's sometimes joined by one or two other people, but who's doing all of the personification of the characters himself and doing like a serial story that you can pick up night after night. This is all part of our heritage. And I think in general, authoritarian powers fear the theater because in theater we have the potential to really take a bird's eye view, take ourselves out of the scenario and see what's happening. And then there's also like theater of the oppressed and verbatim theater, where we can also start to reenact a scenario, pause it, reframe, let it continue, press play, see how it plays out, and then take notes and decide how we'd like to script our future from that point. And we learned from this lesson. I saw it played out. I don't have to take that mistake myself. I don't have to learn the hard way. Here it is in front of me. So what do I want to do otherwise? Also, the fact that it's self-expression and yeah, just self-expression and is foundational to liberation. You shut down the avenues for self-expression, you're shutting down the possibility for somebody to be liberated from the inside out. And so that's why there's such a stronghold on theaters.
Yeah, I think the stage is just really fascinating because on the one hand, it can really hold up a mirror to society. And so if you're somebody watching it, you're looking at somebody portraying your society, and you have never seen it in that way. And that can be very confronting. Like, it can facilitate some kind of awakening when you suddenly start looking around yourself and looking at your own life so differently because you've just seen it in front of you. It's very different when you're in the middle of it. Sometimes you don't see it, but for somebody to put it out like that,
Blinders. Yeah.
exactly, I think is very powerful. And then the other thing is that I think to physically see something in front of you on a stage there is so much beauty, but that is also very empowering. If you read something in a book, like it's in your head, you have to fill in the gaps, and you can set it wherever you want and whatever. Like it's way more abstract. To have it in front of you, like as you said, like I think you can see real possibility if it's
Mhm.
happened in front of you on a stage, you can see that is a real possibility. And if you representing a free world or a free Palestine or a free community on the stage, I think it can really sow those seeds of empowerment. And so I
Mhm.
completely understand why authoritarian powers don't, like how they come down so heavy on theatre, and it's why in Palestine we've seen a real targeting of the creative world. We've seen writers being killed, assassinated. We've seen them being arrested and tortured, like Musab Abu Toha in Gaza very recently. And I understand. I really understand that, and I guess it reminds us about the importance of keeping this alive, in doing what we can to support the artistic world, because they are the ones that are going to help carry forward stories and legacy. And I just wondered if you could, because you are of Palestinian heritage, you are Palestinian, and you were born in Jordan and raised between the US and the Middle East. What is the real sort of significance of storytelling around the world, but in particular when it comes to Palestine? Because I think when we have an oppressor, so much of the narrative and the history is controlled. It's very, very targeted about what narratives are being recorded and carried forward. So the power of actual storytelling between people and within communities, I think, is more important than ever. And I just wondered if you could reflect on that.
Yeah, of course. I think that there are many different. First, to say that being born a Palestinian kind of initiated me into a politicized identity, whether I wanted that or not. And I
Mm.
did want it because I do believe in justice. And I'm a Libra. So that's already just like a native inclination within me, is to really seek justice. Researching and reading and writing about Palestine opened doors to researching and reading and writing about other marginalized communities and other cases of gross injustice. Hala, we are constantly, and all indigenous communities are constantly combating erasure. So we know that history is written by the victor, and that this skews our chronology of events and our perspective of cause and effect. And so it's really important to find ways to create shifts in consciousness through preserving history, through writing misinformation, through telling our stories, through keeping our narrative alive, through tying those cultural artifacts, or let's say artifacts of our culture, like song, like dance, like textile, like food, fables, keeping them alive, because they relay our ancestors' time to the land and their connection to the land. They come from the land, and that's how we keep our connection to the land alive. Yeah, what was you specifically? You asked me a question. Think I spoke around it, but what was the specific question?
That just to speak to the power of storytelling within communities.
Yeah, the power of storytelling. So, a piece like Love Letters from Palestine, when I started to write this poem, Love Letters from Palestine, I hadn't been to Palestine since 96 or 97. And it was 2012 when I wrote that piece. So I felt like I couldn't write from my own perspective. Dana's perspective is quite limited. So I created a character, a Hajj, who was born on the day which we commemorate the Nakba, May 15th, 1948. And through her eyes, we hear the whole story of the occupation of Palestine. And sharing this poem year after year has been an incredible way to not only have a collective grieving ritual, because everyone does feel the heaviness of the story and
Mm.
recognize that the Nakba is ongoing, it started and it never stopped, but also to gain allies and community and solidarity when other people who are non Palestinians hear this story. And also to pay tribute to my ancestors who also were displaced from the Nakba. Creating a shift in consciousness by raising awareness and reframing history. One of the side effects that I never really expected to come out of this is that I start the poem with They call me Nakba, named for the catastrophe born on the same day as I. Welcome 75 years fighting the threat of genocide has left me unspooled, like the thread I use to embroider pillows and thobes with passion and the hope that one day I will again feel at home on this land that my grandfather tilled with his hands under the umbrage of a gold leaf dome. When I first wrote this poem, it was 64 years fighting the threat of genocide. And now it's 75 years. In a couple of months, it's going to be 76 years. So we've grown old together, this Hajj and I, which I can't tell you how painful that is as a side effect that I'd never really expected. In some years, there's bombardments happening and it's so painful, especially this year now. It's so painful to repeat the story again and again. How many more times will this Hajj have to tell her story until someone takes heed, until the ongoing Nakba stops? But I wouldn't give up the opportunity to do so for the world because I feel the impact that it has on my community and those beyond.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Really, really beautiful poem. Thank you so much for sharing that here, but also your determination to continue sharing Hajar's story every year, because it's a reminder that this is not ended. And actually, I believe so strongly in the fact that all freedom struggles are intertwined.
Yeah.
And until we are all free, none of us are free. Like I don't believe that anybody can be free in a world where the current genocide in Gaza, where over 30,000 people have been reportedly killed. The actual figure will be probably more than 40,000,
Yeah.
and children are being absolutely decimated, and people are starving, and women are having to give birth and have emergency C-sections without anesthetic.
Yeah.
Any of us feel as though we can be free in a world where that is happening. And not only is that happening, that is being allowed to be happened, it is being encouraged, it is being supported, it is being legalized. I don't believe that any of us are free. We are all free. And I think you're right in that there is this sense of desperation in terms of like, how much longer, for how many years
Yeah.
are we going to have to keep going until this stops? And it will stop. It has to stop. There's no two ways about it. Palestine will be free, but
Yeah.
what has to be endured by the people?
Indigenous American siblings, this is a relationship of allyship that is very strong, and they've been combating erasure. They've been working towards land back for 500 years. We talk about 75 years and then a perspective of 500 years. On one hand, it's very empowering to see their strength and their solidarity and their community, and the fact that land back is happening in small ways every day, whether it's like gifting land parcels or something is being renamed or there's
Mm,
the right to like conservation. But we still have a long way to go in Palestine. We
mm,
still have a very long way to go. At least people on Turtle Island are acknowledging. When you talk to somebody from so-called United States, they say, this is the territory I am on. It belongs to this indigenous tribe. It's
mm,
so-called Oakland, California, but this is the tribe that whose land I'm on. Wow, what a huge acknowledgement. Let's go a step further. Let's actually stow their relationship to the land back because they were stewards of the land. And on that land, there was also different dynamics of community and food security and housing and rituals and spirituality and relationship. And all of these things come from the land. So there is no restore people in their rightful place to the land in the paradigm of hypercapitalism, in the
mm.
paradigm of neocolonialism. All of this has to change. And it's
Yeah.
all definitely interconnected and interrelated. And I'm so happy to see the allyship between the indigenous Americans of Turtle Island and between the Palestinians, because we recognize the mirrored history of settler colonialism, that a foreign population came by the divine will of God and removed the indigenous inhabitants of that land.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, and I was recently talking a few months ago actually to someone on the podcast from Algeria,
Hmm.
Chenal in France, and she was also reflecting on the sort of shared history in some ways between the French colonization and occupation of Algeria that went on for over 100 years. And she said the thing that we continually that we pray for as Algerians is that Allah don't let the Palestinians have to endure as long as we endured, which was over 100 years. But when we look at 100 years and then we look at 500 years, it's just mind boggling, I think, to just think. Also, the whole thing is completely mind-boggling that you can have this foreign power that just says, I like that land, I'm gonna take it, and I'm gonna give and then another power, which is the UK, to say, oh, there's that community, we're gonna place them
Hmm.
there.
Hmm.
Isn't It's not your land, you can't make that decision, but it's just really very bizarre. You said a little while ago, you said that you, just being born a Palestinian, you were born into this political identity that you didn't even choose, but you're really like grateful and happy about your identity. But I'm always really interested in talking to people that have been born and raised in a place that they're not ancestrally from, and I can, myself included, like my parents are Pakistani, my ancestors are all Pakistani, but I've been born and raised in the UK. And I'm really interested in how people explore identity. Now, the thing with me exploring my identity is that there's never been any physical blocks in me traveling to Pakistan and spending time with my family if I so wanted.
Hmm.
But I guess for Palestinians, you can't always go. You can't, it's very difficult for you to even to like go right now, but just historically it's very difficult. That freedom of movement is not there.
Hmm.
Even the ease of communication is not always there as well because of all the blockades and the control and the load shedding and everything else going on. What has it been like for you over the course of your life, exploring and connecting with your own identity and heritage? And then I guess, how has poetry and writing fed into that?
I would say that it wasn't necessarily bestowed onto me, my Palestinian identity, because I feel like my parents really wanted to assimilate in the United States. We're American. And so, that history is behind us. Let's look forward to the future now. Keep your
Mm.
head directed to the future. And every summer we would go back to Jordan where we would see our families. And then it wasn't until my dad worked in the West Bank at some point in the 90s that I visited Palestine for the first time. And I understood, oh, I'm a Palestinian. Jordan is my home, but it's my home because Palestine can no longer tell why. And so it really woke me up to question my identity. But I was very American, and I went to an American international school my entire life. When I was in Saudi Arabia, for example, I went to an American international school, and then I moved back to the States, and I lived in Kansas, and then I started my university in Kansas, and then I moved to Chicago. So, yeah, I'm American through and through. I really am. And at some point, I remember being at an event in Chicago and somebody asked me where I'm from, and I said, oh, I'm Jordanian. He said, what's your name? I said, Dana Dajani. He said, Dajani are one of the biggest Palestinian families. You are Palestinian, and you need to know who you are. And I just thought, I don't know anything about the Dajanis. So it was really a big influence on my decision to leave the United States, to move back to the Middle East, to dive deeper into the question of who am I and where does my lineage lead me back to. And in 2013, I got to go to Palestine again with a group from the UAE. We planted 1,000 trees in an area called El Khadr on Land Day, which is coming up. It's the end of March. And unfortunately, the trees were uprooted and burned by some settlers and some people from the Israeli forces. But on the trip, this was a few days after we planted it. On the trip, we also got to really tour Palestine. And going in was quite scary because I was held for questioning for 4 hours. Who are you? Who's your father? Who's your grandfather? Who's your great grandfather? That's what I'm here to find out. I knew, of course, but you really have to. I can't tell you the level of fear and adrenaline that was in my body during these interrogations. It's very terrifying. And of course, I had read Rachel Corrie's diary. There's a published version of her diary and the letters that she sent to her parents. Rachel Corrie was an American who was working in Palestine and stood between a bulldozer and a Palestinian home and was crushed in the process. And she's always been a real source of inspiration to me. And I had read her diary before going to Palestine, so I was terrified. And they really monopolize on that fear because they don't want people to come. So they don't want people to have a relationship to their land, to their ancestry, any ties to the land. But I got through. We spent 2-3 weeks in Palestine. I filmed the film version of Love Letters from Palestine there. And after that year, a film that I made, a web film, it was called The Real Truth About the West Bank. And it was made in response to some propaganda videos made by Dana Dajani, the Minister of Foreign Affairs. And the video went viral. This is 2013, and it got 500,000 views. And we had taken over a video made by Danny Ayalon, and so he made a response, and he takes over our video the way we take over his video. So I appear in his video. And all of a sudden, I became the target. So much trolling online by Israelis and by Jewish Americans who sent me death threats to every one of my social media platforms, every one of my emails, who sent me constant harassment. And I tell you, that a long way in encouraging my self-censorship. I was targeted. I wasn't expecting that kind of response. That people wrote articles about me, trying to deface my reputation. It was terrifying, and it took me really years to gain the courage to speak out again, because when you're targeted in that way, you just feel like, oh, nothing is safe. And if I'm posting about the shows that I'm doing, then everyone knows where I am. Maybe I shouldn't post anymore about the shows I'm doing. And it was like a real impulse to just pull into myself and to not be exposed. And again, they benefit from this. So it's in their favor to make people feel threatened and scared and quiet. And because self-censorship is the easiest kind of censorship to do.
Absolutely. And you very recently you lost your grandmother. May Allah raise her in the ranks of Jannah. And you write on social media about having taken the time to really get to know her and get to know where she's from and her life. And I wondered if you could share a little bit about that activity, but that experience in getting to know your grandmother, because I think that is so beautiful, and I feel like you're so fortunate in being able to do that, because so many of us, I don't have any living grandparents anymore, and now that I'm at the age that I know what questions I want to ask, I have no one to ask them. And I just wondered if you could reflect on what that was like, and then also I guess then what losing her has meant and the grief associated with that, and what that means to you.
Yeah, sure. Watching my maternal grandfather at the end of his life, how his memory went from being able to tell a story in 10 details to telling the story in 6 details, to telling the story in 4 details, to repeating the same 2 details. I watched his capacity and his memory decline, and I thought, with my paternal grandmother, I really need to start recording her stories ASAP, because my mother's father was much older. He passed at the age of 102, but my dad's mom was, in her 80s, and I thought, I'm going to start now. So I started recording her stories and asking her about her time in Palestine and asking her how they left Palestine. And over the course of a couple of years, I wrote them down as stories. I thought maybe I'll publish them into a book or make a monologue out of them or something. And every now and then she'd say, like, we have this on video. And I'd ask her, what does that mean, we have it on video? She said, well, we have a video. I said, video didn't come about till the 80s, Teta. What do you mean you have it on video? She said, film, we have it on film. How do you have it on film? In 1971, they bought a camera, a 16 millimeter camera, I believe, and they filmed their travels. So just to preface, before the 70s, we were in Palestine. My grandmother left in 48 to Lebanon, came back in the 50s, married my grandfather in the 60s. And by 67, she had my father and my aunt, and they were all living in Jerusalem. My grandfather used to work for the airline industries. Basically, he was working with Air India at the time, opening new cities as destinations for the airline. So he was always first boots on the ground, which means that he also got five-star treatment. He got hotel, he got some tourism services to go around and see the country, to know how to market it for as a destination for the airline. So after she had my dad and my aunt, my grandfather asked her what she wanted to do with her time. She said, I'll travel with you, I'll buy dresses, and I'll sell them in Jerusalem. So she opened a store called Petit Paris. And when I went to Palestine in 2013, I met an Armenian girl who bought her prom dress from Petit Paris.
Oh,
So even after they left, it stayed open. The store stayed open, which was a really, cool realization to find out. I couldn't find it when I was there in 2013, but years before she had bought her prom dress from there. So then she traveled the world from 71 till 83. They filmed their travels, and I'm talking about from Brazil and Hawaii to Sri Lanka and everywhere in between. And they
wow.
lived in Pakistan because my grandfather worked for the Pakistani ambassador, the door to Pakistan, I should say. And yeah, they lived, Teta calls them, she calls that time of their life when they were living like the poor millionaires,
Oh,
because it was this jet set lifestyle as Palestinian refugees. So first came the stories, then came the videos and the photos, and then came the dresses. A few years ago, she gave me suitcases of hundreds of dresses from around the world. I'm talking about Spanish, Filipino. And then there's also obviously designers from Paris and from London, Hong Kong, and those kind of cities. So this irth, Ken's, it's like a treasure of all of these dresses, which we don't make fashion items with the same level to detail as they used to be made. So you find like really interesting stitches to hide the button and seams, and they're really beautifully made. So in 2019, I was the artist in residence at the Liverpool Arab Arts Festival, which is an amazing annual festival to celebrate Arab arts in the UK. They invited me to present a version of the show that I wanted to make about their life. And so this show centers on belonging and identity and diaspora and our baggage and unpacking that baggage. Literally, I had a suitcase of it and hanging these different pieces and questioning, when did refugee become a dirty word? Because here they were with permission to travel the world and really live this alternative refugee narrative by virtue of Jidda's work. But when did the world decide that refugees are less than, they will not be allowed to come in? We'll look at them as an infestation, and at all costs, we will try and keep our doors closed to those who, maybe because they are in need, because they have been displaced or being persecuted, as opposed to immigrating for economic opportunities. I presented this work, and now there is a new iteration. I have to tell you that along the way, as I continued to dig deeper and ask Teta questions to fill in the gaps of the story that I had, I noticed that she would get very sad. That when I would dig deep enough, she would be overwhelmed with the memory of all that she's lost. Overwhelmed. And it would take her down into a dark hole of sadness. And so I had to stop digging because I recognized that this is painful for her. And whereas I had the intention to transmute that, it wasn't really within her capacity. She was struck by so much longing for all that she had lost, that when she remembered it, really broke her heart. I stopped asking. Another element that I have to share is that I was filming her, and she was always the protagonist of these reels that my grandfather shot the film, and she was always dressed to the nines and beautiful. And I watched her also struggle with accepting her age and her mortality, of not wanting to be on the camera, wanting to be remembered how she was, not wanting anyone to see her this way, even not wanting some people to see her that way of, oh, I'm in a bikini or I'm in a dress, or don't show that to anyone. Yeah, with respect, I'm not going to show anyone anything that you don't want me to show. But it was her own sense of self-preservation that really I had to respect in that time. And so, honestly, I feel you when you say I have questions that I can't ask. Of that, there are many questions that I didn't get to ask her. And so, whenever I meet elders from Palestine and who lived in Palestine, I always put my phone to record and sit down and have some sort of interview with them, because this is the only way we're going to piece together our history, is by holding on to their stories.
And I think that speaks to like your upbringing in America as well, which was when your family were living there, your parents were very much that's the past. Let's focus on the future,
Yeah.
which is why for so long you didn't really engage with your Palestinian identity and heritage. You had to do it by yourself.
Yeah.
I think our parents' generation and our grandparents' generation and those before them, because of everything they endured, never really had the time to, never really had the space to process it, but also it's a huge loss that I don't think we will ever really understand, especially like with your grandparents, the magnitude of what they went through. I don't know if we will ever really have the words to capture that pain and that suffering. And I just think it's so beautiful that you've been able to do the work that you have done, not only for yourself and for your family and for your grandmother herself, I'm sure, but for what people will learn from that and what we can take away from that and the questions that will come up, like you said, around the one around refugees. I was thinking about this just the other night, actually. I was thinking that so much of migration is actually forced migration. If you are living in a country, I will use Pakistan as an example. If you're living in Pakistan and the economy is so awful, the political situation is so unstable, you can't afford to feed your family, the price of flour and rice has quadrupled, but your salary has stayed the same, you're struggling to survive. If you then decide that you're going to go and look for work in another country, be it Turkey, be it Saudi Arabia, be it the UK, is that a real freedom of choice? Is that just not another form of coercion? Have you not just been forced into those circumstances?
Mm-hmm.
And yet, those people will be considered economic migrants. But there is such a forced sense of that. Those people have been pushed into a situation that actually doesn't happen in isolation. The world is so interconnected. The politics of every single country, the economic circumstance of that country is so tied up with everybody else. And I would say with the US and with the UK, like they have huge impacts on the well-being of pretty much all countries around the world, because I know Pakistan and the US have been bombing Pakistan and Afghanistan and Iraq. Do you know what I mean? Like it's so deeply interconnected
Mm-hmm.
that it's all kind of, the blame is all there.
Mm-hmm.
It's not on the person that decided to leave to feed their family. They're not making a choice out. It's not, the freedom of choice is not there. And
And to be
that is happening in the
exploited,
world.
to have their labor exploited for cheap in wherever they go. To whose benefit is that? It's not to
Exactly.
the benefit of the migrant at all.
Exactly. And that's happening the world over. But these people are vilified
Yep.
as they're coming to take advantage, they're coming for their own financial gain. But actually, where is the freedom and the liberation and the choice in that matter? This is about survival,
That's
being
right.
put in a situation that they have done nothing to create those circumstances. It's just, it really, I've been thinking about it a lot recently because there's a lot of talk about immigration law change in the UK and just really in a really unhumane and inhumane
Mhm.
and it it just really, it really saddens me the way that borders are controlled at the moment. But not just that, in the way that some lives seem to matter more than others,
Mhm.
and as we are seeing in Palestine and the silence around the world, some lives matter more than others, and some lives are like they're less than, they're insignificant, they're less than human. I think that's what it comes down to, is that there's human rights, but then these people don't fall under that because they're not seen as human. And it just, yeah, it's really very sad.
Let's look at Ethiopia. How much
Mm.
coverage Ethiopia got in the last 3 years? Sudan is Palestine versus Ukraine. like a sliding scale of skin tone. That's the coverage, that's the concern, that's the, oh my God, the atrocity versus, yeah, what else do they do there? They're always killing each other. It's always at war. No, it's not always at war. And the reason that people are killing each other is because there are factions that are funded to be divisive, that go in and rape and pillage so that somebody else can come in and have the contract to build. That's not just what we do here in this part of the world. So I feel like the way that Western narratives have dominated global media is coming to an end. Now we see that it was all a facade, fueled and backed up by Hollywood, by the way, which I can go off on this, but the way that Hollywood constantly depicts the white savior in every context, way, shape, and form, the white savior who just happens to be like an American GI. He sounds like a GI, he looks like a GI, he has his patches and he has his camo and he has his, yeah, this white savior that's coming to save the day. And also the myth of the superhero. It's so empowering, the idea that somebody blessed with supernatural powers is going to come and save the day. And by the way, in the process of good combating evil, there's going to be a lot of collateral damage. The city is going to burn, but it's okay because good is fighting evil. And in the end, good, who happens to be white American, is going to prevail. You know what I mean? It's such a, but it's drilled in our head time after time that now everyone's, who's the superhero that's going to come and we're just so used to that being the American power that's going to come and bring democracy. And now we can see this has been a lot of wrong kind of theater. It's a facade. It's a lie.
Yeah.
It's an illusion.
Yeah.
And so this is being deconstructed. And as a matter of fact, we have the brown savior when South Africa suing at the ICC
Yes.
and the ICJ. We're going to save each other because our liberation is interconnected and interdependent, and it's not going to come from one higher power.
Absolutely. I think that is the best way to describe things at the moment, in that so many veils have been lifted, I think, for so many people. I don't think like everybody was in this trap before anyway. I think there was growing criticism and consciousness about different things for sure, but I think on the scale that it is, I think I just remember in maybe like November, I was feeling as though for so long we've known that the media is controlled by the Zionist narrative, it's all interconnected, we've known, but it at least felt like they were trying to hide it or they were trying to downplay it. But I feel like over the last few months, it's just been so blatant. And I don't know, I think some of it has been on purpose, but some of it has they've just been exposing themselves. But it's just that you can't look at the British powers or the American powers and see anything other than them being genocide enablers. Like, you just cannot see it. Whereas like before, you can see, okay, they're doing this like middle road. You can see that there's at least an attempt to appear to be understanding of the situation. And now in the UK, because the election will be happening at some point this year, most likely the general election, there is like a scrambling of the Labour Party, especially, who are trying to now, oh, we're not genocide enablers, oh, we're calling for a ceasefire, da, da, da. And it is comical. It is actually comical. And I'm very much worried about the state of British politics. I don't know what's going to happen in the next election, but it is comical, but also very disenfranchising to see that as well, because now you're like, the one vote I have in determining who sits in power is my vote at the election, but who on earth do I vote for, because you're all the same. But I find it so interesting how everything seems to be out in the open now, and I think social media plays a huge role in that, because nothing is missed. So many small details that would otherwise have been missed are picked up on and shared, and I think it's such a brilliant time to be alive, to be able to witness that kind of stuff, because we know that we've been told constantly that part of a democratic system is to have a free press. We do not have a free press.
That's right.
There is no free press. No, in the UK, certainly not in the US, and I think the US is even worse in
Mhm.
terms of its media than the UK.
That's right.
But it's a huge, it's really an important thing to reflect on.
Mhm.
But also, I think to celebrate the alternative media, the social media activists, Palestinian and non-Palestinian, who are doing the work that needs to be done right now. This isn't a not even like a choice. This is what we have to do. This is what these times are asking of us to do. And actually, I feel guilty myself that I'm not doing enough to raise my voice about what's happening in Sudan, in the Congo. And I think that also speaks to the fact that, which is what you said, which is the coverage is so minimal right now. And I really hope that we see a change in that as well moving forward, because that situation is absolutely terrible also.
Yeah, I mean, amazing points about the fact that, to have a fair election, you have to have freedom of the press. And as we can see, we used to know, as you said, that, okay, the Western media has a Zionist inclination. But I think that
Yeah.
we all thought it's okay because under the Zionist inclination, there's actually freedom of speech, there's actually human rights, but now we see that none of those actually
Yeah.
exist. So that's falling apart. And similar to what's happening with the Labour Party, the Democratic Party is scrambling now to try and angle themselves or re angle Genocide Joe so that he can get votes again. But it's a huge year, it's a huge election year in the world. I think something like over 1 billion people are going to be placing votes in so called democratic elections. Personally, I think that the ideal of democracy, we are not seeing it enacted anywhere in the world.
Mm.
So the illusion of democracy to crumble is going to be the precedent for us to create something lasting and effectual in its place, not something that pacifies us with the facade of democracy. Meanwhile, it's a corporatocracy, and that's who's pulling the
Mm.
strings. So I really am excited to be alive. Like you said, I think it's our gift, and it should encourage us all to take on our mission, to be part of the transition, to consider the world that we're leaving behind. Because, especially when you bring technology into the conversation and the way that technology is developed by and for the military industrial complex, we're walking a very fine line. Once the facade of democracy falls, it can either go into authoritarianship or it can go towards liberation. So, this is where we have to really be empowered to make sure that it doesn't fall the other way and that we move towards a even more realized version of the ideal of democracy, as opposed to saying it doesn't exist anyway, you're all under control.
Absolutely. Oh, you're right. It is. It's a huge year in terms of elections, and it will be a huge year to see what happens around the world as well, with all the places and the states that are currently oppressed so massively in ways that I don't even have words, I think, left anymore to just talk about the horrors. Like I feel like those words have dried up. But yeah, I'm very also intrigued to see what happens with the elections around the world and what that will do politically.
Mhm.
It'll be very interesting. I just want to touch on how you use, but how generally we can use poetry as a form of resistance and activism.
Yeah, so it's a means to poetry. What I love about it is that it speaks to the heart. If we're talking from our intellects, we can put these ideas up against each other and really stay there head to head. But head to head even gives you the connotation of opposing forces, whereas heart to heart gives the connotation of collective, communal, collaborative forces. What I love
Mm.
about poetry is that it is a transmission from the heart to the heart. And we get beyond those ideas that you stand by. And if I can make you feel with me, that's the root of empathy, which leads to compassion, which leads to connection, which that's
Mm.
the path. And so, even with Love Letters from Palestine, towards the end, love is all that's left. Though my heart has hardened like the stone pit of an olive, it's still an appeal to one's humanity. And although we can think that we're so intellectual and we're so smart, we understand and we know, the real wisdom is in the heart. It's not in the mind. The mind can play so many tricks on us. I've got running behind right now. The AI agrees. Wisdom is in the heart.
That was a celebration of what you just said.
Yeah, so poetry is finding what does your heart have to say? Really finding what it is, what's the message that your heart has, and sharing that with the rest of the world. And when we can speak to each other heart to heart, we're going to start to realize that there is so much more that connects us, that unites us, than there are things that differentiate us. And if we can stand in our power united, we will be unstoppable.
That is so beautiful and so powerful. My final question actually is reflecting on something that you said fairly recently. You said, women are poetry and poetry is women. Now, I am fascinated. What do you mean? What do you mean by women are poetry and poetry is women?
The feminine emotive, is receptive, is fluid, is illogical, not in a bad way, illogical. It's even beyond logic, again, coming out of the head and into the heart. So these are all feminine inheritance. And yeah, and it's not to say that men can't write poetry. No, of course men can write poetry. But yeah, I really feel like poetry is women in the all of the things that my friends create, sometimes in the way that they just hold their child or deal with their elder or make a meal or beautify their home. I feel like there's poetry in every action, and there's a desire for beauty and a desire for wholeness and a desire for balance. And we find all of those also in poetry. Poetry celebrates the beautiful. There's balance in the rhythm. It's complete, even if it's fragmented. Oh yeah, that's what I meant by the fact that poetry is women and women are poetry.
That is so beautiful. And I also agree. I think there is a lot of poetry in just the lives of women, in what we do, in the capacity we hold, the way we love, the way we nurture. And again, that doesn't mean that men are not poetic and men cannot write, because these are the things within us that I think also exist within men, but it's what I think overpowers. I think for women, it overpowers. It is everything. But yeah, and Dana, it has been such a privilege speaking to you today. I'm
Good.
feeling so like warm and inspired, and thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. I really appreciated the conversation and look forward to connecting further, Samia. Thank you.
If you enjoyed this episode, please follow the Diverse Bookshelf on your podcast platform of choice. I'd really appreciate it if you could rate and leave a review, as it helps more people find the show. I'd love to hear from you, so come connect with me on social media.